Welcome to this Auxiliary Marking Club video on collecting auxiliary markings, a primer. I'm Gregg Redner. I'm a Board of Directors member of the Auxiliary Markings Club, and I'm glad you're here today. In this video, we're going to discuss topics that include what is and what is not an auxiliary marking, the various types of markings, what do they tell us, telling a story through auxiliary markings, and a few thoughts on typology. What do auxiliary markings do? Well, an auxiliary marking helps to move the mail. They're designed to hold, redirect, return, forward, or indicate why a piece of mail has not arrived in the usual timely fashion. They can be very simple, such as the card on the screen currently. This card was held for delivery and not delivered because it had insufficient postage on it. You can see that it was held for the postage at the post office, and the numbers underneath, December 5th, 1908, will tell you what day it arrived and when it was first held. Here's an example of an address that was incorrect or no longer correct. And so when it arrived at the post office, they knew to redirect it to the person at the following address on the label. And you'll see here's an auxiliary markings label redirected to which shows us that the mail was sent on and forwarded. Of course, this is one of the favorite examples of an auxiliary marking, and there are lots of people that collect pointing fingers. And as hard as it is to imagine, there are hundreds and hundreds of different examples of these, and people are still finding examples of the pointing finger that nobody knew existed. What does the pointing finger tell us? Well, it says that to return the mail to the sender, and usually gives us some sort of indication why it's being sent back. This is really quite a remarkable cover. Now, if you look at this, you really won't see any printed auxiliary markings, and there certainly aren't any auxiliary labels on this. Yet, there are, I don't know how many different addresses on here. And in this case, I would say that the auxiliary markings are the lines that cross out the incorrect address and the people who have written in the forwarding address. And it's quite a remarkable cover, originally from Sarawak to Japan, and it was eventually forwarded to Chicago and then Pittsburgh, via Vancouver and Kuching. Just a remarkable cover. So auxiliary markings don't have to necessarily say anything. They can also indicate that something is not valid. Here's an airmail letter that was delayed due to an airmail interruption near Salt Lake City in Utah, giving the date when it was held and delayed. So what is an auxiliary marking? Well, this is a definition that can be found on the Auxiliary Marking Club website. An auxiliary marking is a postal marking applied to covers by hand stamp, machine cancellation, stick-on label, manuscript markings, or mechanical or electronic methods such as addressograph or computer, indicating that the covers were given special attention due to some special circumstance. A broad definition would include accompanying postal service letters, ambulance covers in which damaged or misdirected mail has at times been delivered, and markings placed on covers by institutions other than the Postal Service, such as the military, prisons, hotels, etc. Auxiliary markings are sometimes known as instructional markings or supplementary markings. Let's take a look now at some of the different types of auxiliary markings and labels. Now, on the Auxiliary Marking Club website, you'll see that in addition to cancellations, meter marks and addressograph labels are also listed as potential auxiliary markings. That's not to say that all cancellations, meter marks, and addressograph labels are in fact auxiliary marks. They serve as auxiliary marks when those markings tell us something about the way the mail is being handled forwarded, or redirected. This is an example of a beautiful cancellation, but one which doesn't fulfill that purpose. Of course, censor markings are auxiliary markings put on by the military to show that a particular letter has passed the military judgment of whether it can be forwarded during wartime. Crash covers are another example of a auxiliary marking. Here's a marking that tells us that this letter was salvaged from an aircraft crash near Singapore in 1954. Of course, mail can be damaged, and this auxiliary marking tells us that on the odd chance that this piece of mail was damaged in the fire, it explains to the recipient why the cover is in such rough shape. It says it was damaged by fire on the SS Cormorant. Mail can be delayed too, and this is one of my favorite auxiliary markings. It's really wonderful in its glorious specificity. The postmaster regrets that this letter has been inadvertently delayed in the post and wishes to express regret for any convenience occasioned. And this, of course, is an armed forces letter. Sometimes mail was disinfected. This happened a lot during cholera outbreaks and epidemics in Europe in the 15th and 16th century. Here is an indication that this piece of mail, which is going to Messina during one of their epidemic outbreaks, has in fact been disinfected. Sometimes you'll have hand stamps as well. This PP marking indicates that, of course, this is a pre-stamped letter, indicates that the postage has been paid, port payee, and that no money needs to be collected at the other end at delivery time. Military markings can also be associated with deliverability. Here is a cover that has a great deal of information on it that explains why this particular letter was delayed when it was sent to servicemen overseas. Here's an example of a meter marking. This meter marking, just to give you a clear idea of what a meter marking is, doesn't fulfill our requirement of an auxiliary mark because there's no additional information. This is just simply a franking marking, but I thought it was important to show one so that you could see what you need to look for. And what you're looking for in terms of auxiliary markings that fulfill the meter marking is to find something that says this is being forwarded because of or redirected. Here's again the pointing finger, as we said. This is being returned to the writer, to the sender in 1897 because it was unclaimed in Chicago. This is actually quite a wonderful pointing finger because it also gives in the suit jacket sleeve on the bottom the date that it was to be returned. Postage due, of course, can also be an auxiliary marking. Here, the T, which was the standard tax mark or postage due mark in Europe at the time, is most certainly an auxiliary marking to tell us that this is insufficient postage. In this case, which is really very interesting, the person that sent this card paid for it with a postage due stamp. Half a postage due stamp, which of course at the time was not legal, and the postage due stamp had no ability to pay for the mail, so it was hit with a tax mark. Here's some returned mail, spectacular label that went on this, and a really very special ones. Usually don't find them this large. This letter, in fact, redirects it to the dead letter office. Sometimes there are markings such as this checked marking that indicate that some security protocol was carried out to guarantee that this envelope was safe to be delivered. In this case, it was right after the anthrax scare that happened in the US, and a lot of government offices began to check the mail and make sure that it was safe to be delivered. And checked indicates that it had been checked, and it was. Of course, there are spray-on markings as well. This particular spray-on marking is a test marking, but nonetheless, these can also give you information about the redirection or the sending or delay of mail. Of course, this is a modern version, the yellow forwarding label, return to sender, unclaimed, unable to forward. And these come in a multitude of different examples. And so I always find that when I'm looking at modern mail, I always check the yellow labels to see if it's something that I have not seen before. This is a pretty standard one, but nonetheless. So the thing is, when you collect auxiliary markings and labels, there really isn't a right or wrong way to do this. And so I say whatever you enjoy collecting is what you should collect. I'm particularly fond of Belgian absent markings, auxiliary labels in this case, and I have a collection of these, and here's quite a late one. Very interesting in that after World War II, Belgium has two languages, official languages, Flemish and French, Flemish in the north and French in the south. There was a great deal of discontent in the Flemish-speaking areas of the country because Flemish was always accorded second status. And so the post office came up with a very unique way of indicating of allowing whichever language you chose to give precedence to be able to do that. And in this case, we can tell that this was definitely a Flemish post office. So you can oftentimes tell the story of the cover through auxiliary markings. And I find that even back in the beginning days of mail delivery, that this is the case. The question here is, what can three little lines tell us? Well, if we take a look at the top of this early stampless cover, we notice that there are three crayon markings. Well, that doesn't seem to be very specific, but there are things that we can tell because of this. Number one, this was probably carried by a community mail carrier, someone who was not working for Turn Taxus or the Royal Post. There was a tremendous amount of discontent in Europe at this time because mail was essentially only available to the wealthy, the religious, and royalty. So there was an agreement eventually that one would be able to send mail from city to city by community post. So what do we know? Well, we know, first of all, this was not sent by Turn Taxus, and it's not a royal piece of mail. I'll explain to you how we can tell that later on. But what we do know is that this was probably carried by community post because the community post carrier only had to be able to indicate the amount of postage that was due on the piece of mail. They didn't actually have to be able to read or write particularly well. This was not done at a desk. This was done in the field. And so those three crayon markings indicate the amount of money that the person receiving the mail would have to pay. Take a look in the lower left-hand corner where it says Chito, Chito, Chito. That's the marking for quick, 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 rapid, rapid, rapid. The person who is sending this piece of mail is trusting the carrier, perhaps a little bit of additional money, to get the letter there as quickly as possible. What's the strange little squiggle in the middle? Well, this 1693 stampless cover um, has a pen marking on it. That's different than the 3 strokes we saw on the earlier marking. What can we tell from this? But we can tell that there are 2 units available, or 2 units required in terms of payment, probably stivers, but it could be one of the other, could be centimes, francs as well. We know that this was not carried by community post because the person writing it um, had at his availability a pen and ink, which means he had a desk, which means that this was no doubt taken to an office for delivery. And it's not a turn in taxis letter, but it could be a slightly later official post. What does the lack of an auxiliary marking tell us? Well, first of all, this is a very fancy letter. It was tied. It's on parchment. It was tied and sealed with those bands at the top. What we know in this particular case is that this is in fact a religious letter, which would have been carried from monastery to monastery. And was the way of communicating. There was no postage on this. The expectation was that the monk that was carrying the letter would be given food and housing so that he could recoup for the return. So in this case, we know that there was no postage due. We know that it did not go through an office, so it was clearly carried from one place to another. This could also, of course, be an early royal letter, but in this case, it's a religious letter. Now, this letter was sent from Ghent via the sea because there was a blockade to Amsterdam. How do we know this? Well, at the bottom, there are 2 strokes. We know that this was carried by a community carrier to either the border or perhaps to Ostend, which was a seaport. It couldn't be carried to the border and then picked up at a transit house to be carried to its eventual destination in Amsterdam because of the blockade. So you see at the top, there's an additional 6 stivers that are due on this because of the long route that this was sent at the time. Well, here's an indication of a couple of things on the front of this. First of all, there's that wonderful squiggle. The question is it paid? Well, if there is a number written on the front of a cover, like this, a letter, then it is not paid. This shows that there is postage due. Sometimes the number is written on the back of the cover, and that shows the amount that was paid, prepaid for the letter. So this was sent from Ghent in the north of Belgium to Seville in Spain. So where and when? How was it posted? Well, in those days there was no mechanism unless you had a postal agreement between your countries for the prepayment of mail once it crossed the border. So if you look, there's a hand stamp at the top that says Ghent, Franco, and that tells us that the letter was paid to the border in Belgium. There's also a slash that goes from left to right, which is another indication that this was that there's no postage due within Belgium. But when it got to the border, there's an indication in pen that there will be postage due when it arrives in Seville. Again, why no markings on this? This is a royal letter that was sent by royal carrier. I don't know for certain whether it was turn in taxis, but it is a very early 1580s communication. Hence, the fact that it was carried from palace to palace or state building to state building indicates that there was no postage due on it because it was a government issue. So there's some other indications of payment, we'll start at the top right. Franco always indicates that a letter is paid at least within the country. Under that to the right is port payee, which also indicates the same. Port betold is a Dutch marking for that. Sometimes you'll see the red at the bottom in the center en numeraire, which also indicates that the letter was paid in advance. That's a beautiful triangular Avignon port payee marking above to show that the letter was paid internally. If you take a look at the upper left, there's a slightly later French marking. And underneath, the strange group of squiggles that look like FCOHAMBG actually stands for Franco-Hamburg, to show that the this letter, which in this particular case was coming from Holland, was actually paid because of a postal agreement all the way to Hamburg, where it may have been delivered or may have been carried on to another European destination where there was no postal agreement. So this one is the overload of overloads. First of all, we've got a Franco marking in the upper left-hand corner telling us that it was paid. We have the port payee hand stamp, which tells us that the post office agrees that it has been paid. The original marking is by the person that sent the letter. The hand stamp indicates that the post office agrees it's been paid. And last of all, for the carrier, there's a slash on the front to show that there is no postage due. Let's take a look at a couple of these. This is, I think you can figure this one out if you actually take a minute to look at it. The one on the left goes from Bastogne, which is in Belgium, to a town called Colmar. And Colmar is in Alsace in France. So this particular piece of mail was postmarked in Bastogne, but not prepaid. Indicates that it came from Bastogne, from the French department number 98, because Belgium was part of France in those days. And there is postage due because of the mark on the front. Look at the one on the right. This one says PP 96, Liege. Port payee in department 96 also indicates, unlike the other side, that this one has been paid. And of course, it's marked port payee in the bottom. And in this case, they didn't want any question whatsoever. So there's been a big X put across the front of this cover. So here's an example of an very early port payee hand stamp. Yes, port payee in Department 86 in the city of Mons in Belgium appears in the upper right. There is again, an X across to indicate that it's been paid. But now we have a marking saying that the PP in the box is port payee marking, which is official to the post office to show that it has been paid to Paris. Take a look at the upper left. Here's some other interesting auxiliary markings. The blue box indicates which rayon this letter was sent from. So rayons were like regions, beginning at the French Belgian border and moving backwards. The higher the number, the closer you would be to, say, Holland. This was sent from rayon number 4, so it's quite a ways from the border. And if you look at the amount of postage that's due, it's quite a large amount. The 2 digits there. And above that, you'll see a red hand stamp that says après le départ, which means that the piece of mail was received after the mail for the day had already gone, and that's why it was delayed for a day. In the bottom right, you'll see a receiving mark at the transit station, indicating that it came from Belgium and was now in France. look at the back of the envelope. In this case, there is no postage listed on the back, no number on the back. If the postage number had been, a postage value had been written on the back, we would know that the mail had been prepaid, but it's on the front, so we know it's not. Here are a couple of other interesting markings. The par estafette means that the mail was sent by express. This was sometimes a faster moving, smaller postal carriage, sometimes on horse. And if you take a look, it says Belgique par Valenciennes, which means that the letter is from Belgium and entered at the city of Valenciennes, which is the transit station. Here's a port pay marking, a different one. There are many, many different ones. This one in a kind of trapezoidal box in blue. Interestingly, a lot of people ask this question about Belgian mail. Why is Brussels always indicated in blue? And nobody's really sure about this, but almost all of the Brussels markings are in blue. And it's a very interesting question. So this is an interesting one. You'll see it says Bureau B. We don't know which area of Brussels this came from, and Bureau B helps us to know the particular office that it was sent from. Now, take a look at this one. It's quite interesting. You've seen that marking, and by the way, I've just told you that all Brussels hand stamps are generally in blue. This is a rare example, which is in red. Don't ask me why, I'm not sure. But if you take a look at the top of the letter, there's a P with nothing in between it. PP Brussels, and then a port payee marking underneath that, which is an unboxed one, which is really unframed one, which is really unusual. This is very interesting. When Belgium became an independent country, there was such a distaste for the French that until new canceling devices and port pay markings could be created, they took a file and removed the number in between the P and the P on that upper port pay Brussels marking, because they just wanted to be rid of any remembrance of the French, and so they filed the departmental markings out of that. Here's an international marking. It tells us that this is going via Frankfurt, the Von Frankfurt. It's also noticed under the third line in the center, it says half franc, half franco. That means it's half paid to Frankfurt. It's eventually going to Bolzano in Italy. Now, take a look. In the center at the top, there's a new marking, PD. This appeared after the creation of the General Postal Union. It was now possible, because of bookkeeping and record keeping and agreements, to prepay a letter entirely to its destination. Because it was possible to report what percentage of the postage would go to the receiving country for delivery. This PD marking, Port Destinaire, paid to the destination, is a new auxiliary marking. Okay, enough on that. Now we're going to just spend a second talking about typologies. If you have not watched Gordon Smith's excellent discussion about organization and typologies, which is an earlier video on our YouTube channel, I would encourage you to do that. But just as an overview, you can collect by type of marking. You can collect by date or period. You can collect by difference. Is it a label? Is it a hand stamp? Is it a manuscript marking? Is the hand stamp have a frame around it? Is it one line, two lines? If it's a label, what color is it? Are the internal lines solid or are they broken? Um, that's a really good way to begin to organize them. You can collect by region. Oftentimes, as you'll discover, especially if you collect US auxiliary markings, there wasn't a standard marking, and they were produced within individual regions or cities by the actual post office or someone in that city. You can collect by whatever is most useful to you. Permission to collect in the most obscure, unusual way if it's of value to you. I want to tell you about a couple of remarkable books. This is an absolutely remarkable study of New York City auxiliary markings between 1798 and 2022 by Tony Warwickevich and Tom Bresky. Tony has recently died, and he was one of the absolute greatest minds when it came to auxiliary markings and postal rates and all of the things that make the movement of the mail remarkable. Tony is going to be greatly missed, but this book will be a tribute to his remarkable work. There's also this book, which is Chicago Postal Markings and Postal History. Again, a very detailed study of the way that the mail moved within the Chicago post office. Both of these books are available from the APS, and you can find them on your stamps.org. Also on the APS, there are a couple of remarkable courses, Understanding Auxiliary Markings and Their Importance, which is a 3-session on-demand course, which is very useful and is available online. And then there's John Hotchner's Solving Auxiliary Markings Puzzles, a 3-session on-demand course, also available on the APS website. And John, of course, is one of the founding members and the current president of our own Auxiliary Markings Club. So this is just the beginning. Collect what interests you. Collect what enriches your collecting journey. There's no right or wrong way to collect auxiliary markings. And study them to improve your enjoyment and, most importantly, if you exhibit, your exhibiting scores. Last of all, if you're not a member of the Auxiliary Markings Club, we encourage you to join us. Membership is $18 a year, for which you receive 4 editions of our newsletter, Auxiliary Markings. And there's an excellent website which has all kinds of remarkable information on it, and you can find that at postalmarkings.org. Thanks for being with us, and thank you for taking the time to stay with us through this video. If you are interested in the topic and there are things that you would like to see us cover on future videos, please follow the email addresses on the website and let us know. Thanks very much.